Wanted to point out where was I? I didn't even see it.
You're the only guy who can't get elected.
I swear to God.
That's your problem. That kind of an attitude, you don't get elected.
A big round of applause for you and us and the whole process. There's going to be cheese and wine somewhere. Right outside.
I wanted to point out
I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to the first event of the Community Media Conference called Back to Basics. Chittenden Community TV has been doing public access video for about 2 years. By public access, what we mean is alternatives to mass media. People having the opportunity to make videos, make any kind of media they want, put it on the air on cable, distribute it to groups, basically get their hands on the means to production. It's a very exciting prospect for us, and it's also very exciting for us to welcome regional producers of public access from all over the Northeast and New York, as well as Vermont educators. This event came about after some conversations. I think one of the main instigators is the mayor, who's always very interested in the dialogue between the press and political figures. We are certainly always interested in that, and we've been very fortunate to have this wonderful arrangement of people here to talk about that relationship. Paul McIsaac, who's a correspondent for National Public Radio as well as an advocate of community media, will be moderating, and I'll just hand it over to you.
People will be coming in as we go along, and some of our guests might actually have to leave before, although I suspect it'll become interesting enough that people will want to stay. The panel, as you see before you, looks a little bit like the men's club here, and may say something about some of the problems of the media. One of the worst is, get this camera, I feel like the typical reporter who writes a story and then sees it in the paper the next day with a headline that completely either belies or inflames the story that he's written. This ad says, "Does the media lie? Find out. Sanders, Jeffords, Burns interview the Vermont Press Corps." If that's not a setup for us having something less than an interesting philosophical learning discussion, part of the problem. I think I was invited for a couple of reasons. One is that for a number of years at Goddard College, I ran a program called Community Media, in which students, graduate and undergraduate students, tried to understand some of the choices that we have in the world in terms of media. Generally speaking, most media fall into two categories. The business-oriented media, which the United States is, of course, the most well-known for, based on a notion of free enterprise, and how successful you are will tell how successful your business will be. The state-controlled media, which we see much more in socialist countries and very often in underdeveloped countries. And that kind of state media, certainly the reporters and some of the people who work in it have more security, but it has, of course, many problems with censorship and sort of the official view. Community media is an idea that's really maybe 20 years old. Community television stations, community radio stations, small print, has always been an attempt to find a kind of third way. And CCTV is here today and is taping this. This will be seen by people on the cable, and these are the kind of ideas that are community media ideas. Before I introduce the panel, I for many years have, like many of us, heard the term the fourth estate, which is the press. And in recent years, people have used the term the fifth estate, which is supposed to apply to television and radio. I never knew where it came from, so I went to the Burlington Public Library and looked it up. And it seems that Edmund Burke is the one who first coined this phrase in Parliament. It would be about the time of the American Revolution, and he was standing in Parliament and he said that we have the estate of the Lord's spiritual. I don't think we have any of those here today. He said we have the estate of the Lord's temporal. We have at least a couple of them with us today. And we have the commons. That's you folks. And then he pointed to the gallery and he said, yonder sits the fourth estate, more important than them all. The fifth estate is television's way, I'm sure it was TV who invented it, television's way to get itself in there. And there may be some questions in this. And these are some of the questions that we want to ask. People called me before I came up and said, you know, there have been some sort of almost confrontations between Bernie and the press, and that, boy, this will be a chance for a real showdown. I, for one, hope that we're able to get beyond the notion of a showdown at all and try to do what normally can't happen in the process of politics and the press. Issues are under pressure. There has to be quick judgments, and the press has to quickly write them. This is a chance for people to talk about some of the underlying ideas, the underlying philosophies, the approaches that they take, what they're responsible for doing. We have maybe an hour and a half together, and I'd like to take 5 minutes more, if I could. This is pretty typical in community media terms. One of the ideas that's developed amongst people who philosophically look at the media and politics in this country is the notion of the emperor's new clothes. The idea that we've developed a culture and a society in which people, in fact, can be operating, whether they're political leaders or whether they are in the media, that they can be operating and all of us can be pretending that they're fully dressed and they're really not. That in a sense we've reached the point in our culture where we're willing to accept the fact that hypocrisy is going on. And I went back to the source on this one too, and bear with me, it might be a nice tone before we begin to go back to the original source. Take about 5 minutes. It's Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote this about 1826, and I think it raises some of the questions that underlie some of the questions between press and government. Many years ago there lived an emperor who was excessively fond of brand new clothes. He spent all his money on them, and he wanted them to be very fine. He didn't care about his soldiers, nor about the theater. He only liked to drive out and show his new clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day. And just as they would say the king is in council, they would also say the emperor is in his new wardrobe. In the great city in which he lived, it was always merry, and every day there came strangers. One day, 2 rogues came. Today, I guess we're going to try to figure out who these rogues are. One day 2 rogues came, and they put themselves out as weavers and declared that they could weave the finest stuff anyone could imagine. Not only were their colors and patterns, they said, uncommonly beautiful, but the clothes made of this stuff possessed a wonderful quality, that they became invisible to anyone who was unfit to hold office or was incorrigibly stupid. Those would be capital clothes, thought the emperor. If I wore those, I should be able to find out what men in my empire are not fit for places they have. I could tell the thieves, I could tell the clever from the dunces. Yes, this stuff must be woven for me directly. And he gave the 2 rogues a great deal of cash in hand that they might go about their work. As for them, they put up 2 looms, and they pretended to be working, but they had nothing on their looms at all. They at once demanded the finest silks and costliest gold. This they put into their own pockets and worked at the empty looms late into the night. I should like to know how far they've gotten on with this, thought the emperor. But he felt quite uncomfortable when he thought that those who were not fit for their office could not see it. He believed indeed that he had nothing to fear for himself. And yet he pre-offered first to send someone else to see how matters were going. All the people in the city knew the peculiar power that this stuff possessed, and all were anxious to see how bad and how stupid their neighbors were. I will send my old honest minister to the weavers, thought the emperor. He can judge best the stuff, how best the stuff looks, and no one understands his office better than he. Now the good old minister went to the hall where the two rogues were working at the empty looms. Mercy on us, thought the old minister, and he opened his eyes wide. I can't see anything at all. But he didn't say this. Both the rogues begged him to be so good as to come nearer and ask if he didn't approve of the colors and patterns. Then they pointed to the empty loom. The old minister went on opening his eyes, but he couldn't see anything at all, for there was nothing to see. Mercy, he thought. Can I indeed be so stupid? I never thought that, but not a soul must know it. Am I not fit for office? No, it will never do for me to say that. Don't you have anything to say about it? One of them asked. Oh, it's very charming, very enchanting, answered the old minister, as he peered through his spectacles. What a fine pattern, what colors. Yes, I'll tell the emperor that I was very much pleased with it. The episode is repeated, and I'll skip the repeat. He sends two more ministers, and they do the same thing. Finally, the emperor himself is anxious to wear the new clothes. So he goes, and he says to himself, I can't see anything. This is terrible. Am I stupid? Am I not fit to be emperor? That would be the most dreadful thing in the world. And then he said aloud, oh, it is very pretty. It just is, it is the highest approbation. And he nodded in a contented way and gazed at the empty loom, for he knew that there was nothing else he could say. The whole suite of people he had brought with him looked and saw nothing any more than the rest. But like the emperor, they said, it is pretty, it is pretty. It's splendidly excellent. And so he appointed the rogues imperial court weavers. The whole night before and the morning on, the procession was to take place. The rogues were up and kept more than 16 candles burning. The people could see that they were hard at work, completing the emperor's new clothes. They pretended to take the stuff down from the looms. They made cuts in the airs with their great scissors. They sewed with needles without thread. And they said, now the clothes are ready. And the emperor came himself with his noblest cavaliers. And the two rogues lifted up one arm as if they were holding something. And they said, see, here are the trousers. Here's the coat. Here's the cloak, and so on. It's as light as a spider's web. One would think you had nothing on, but that's just the beauty of it. Yes, said the cavaliers, but they couldn't see anything at all. Will your imperial majesty please descend to take off your clothes, said the rogues. Then we will put on you the new clothes here in front of the great mirror. The emperor took off his clothes, and the rogues proceeded to put on him each new garment as it was ready. And the emperor turned around and around before the mirror. Oh, how well they look. How capably they fit, he said. What a pattern, what colors. This is a splendid dress. They are standing outside under the canopy which is to be borne above your majesty in the procession, announced the minister of ceremonies. Well, I'm ready, replied the emperor. Does it not suit me well? And then he turned again to the mirror, for he wanted to appear as if he was contemplating his new adornments. The two chamberlain who were carrying the train stooped down with their hands towards the floor, just as if they were picking up the mantle, when they pretended to be holding something in the air, because they didn't dare let on that they saw nothing. So the emperor went in procession under the rich canopy, and everyone in the streets said, that's the commoners, how incomparable are the emperor's new clothes. What a train he has on his mantle. How well it fits him. No one would let on. No one would let it be perceived that they saw nothing, for that would have shown that he was not fit for his office or was very stupid. No clothes of the emperor's had ever gotten such success. But he has nothing on, said a little child. Just hear what that innocent says her father. But it whispered throughout the crowd, and finally, but he has nothing on, the whole people at length yelled. That touched the emperor, for it seemed to him that they were right. But he thought within himself, I must go through with this procession. And so he held himself a little higher, and the chamberlains held on tighter than ever and carried the train on, which didn't exist at all. So who are the rogues? And who's the emperor? We thought that the way we would start this process is to reverse the tables a little bit and ask three political personalities, two of whom are in office now, to be the interviewers of the press. With us we have, their names are in front of them, Vermont Congressman Jim Jeffords. His reputation, I think, is one of having excellent relationship with the press. We'll see what we can do about that today. Brian Burns, the former Burlington alderman, and was most recently in a campaign running for mayor, and had a very direct relationship with the press, and will have much to say about that.
The press might point out that he has not been an alderman. I think we try to keep some things straight. Brian was lieutenant governor.
Oh, excuse me. I'm just reading what they gave me.
Not that the media is ever wrong. I mean, that's, we start off with that assumption.
And that was Bernie Sanders. And I suppose the one story that someone reminded me of recently is that the night that Bernie was first elected in 1980 at the Free Press, when the news came in, the reporters cheered.
1981.
1981.
Not that we want to correct the media again. We understand there's always accuracy.
The story is that the press cheered. They're not necessarily cheering now. To my left is Nick Montserrat, who is the managing editor of the Rutland Herald. Good. I got that. Tom Farmer is correspondent for WCAX-TV, which is the CBS affiliate here. Is that all correct?
That's right, and my name is spelled right, too.
Peter Frayne, correspondent for WDOT-AM, Vanguard Press, and writes for the Rutland Herald. So there are three chairs out there with tape on it. I'd ask the three of you to go out and have a seat out there. Just take one of those chairs, and we're going to have a little press conference. And I'm going to play a different role, which is press secretary, I guess, for the press.
What was this for, actually?
We're going to come back. We're just going to take a few minutes. Any chair you like. I thought we'd have a full house, so. I'd like to welcome you here this afternoon for this press conference. Three members of the Vermont Press have decided it was finally time that they would have an unstructured press conference, allowing first political leaders to ask them questions, and if you'll allow me to conduct that at some point later on, members of the Commons will also be able to ask questions of the press. After a while, we'll resume our seats, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the implications of that. The press is here, and they're prepared to answer your questions. Mr. Jeffords, would you like to begin?
I would like to ask some questions to try and ascertain, if I might, from the press corps what their responsibilities are under certain circumstances in the reporting of news events, and most particularly the people that are involved in, we think sometimes, making the news. I'm not going to get involved in the no-close routine, in the sense that I don't believe that I want to inquire as to whether it's appropriate for people to make misstatements or wrong statements or what, but rather editorializing. That is, editorializing through fact selection and rearrangement or arrangement. And I'm going to give you an actual case history and then ask you as to whether or not you feel it's an appropriate reporting. And this is from my past, distant past, fortunately. Haven't had occasions recently to raise these things, but let me give you a little factual background. At the time I was in the state senate, I had raised serious questions about Phil Hoff's tax reform, which bringing back the federal tax upon the our Vermont tax and the federal tax. One of the reporters was very much enthralled, I think, with both the governor and that proposal. She was very upset with me. The next morning, we had a meeting in the general committee wherein we took up what appeared to be very innocuous events. There had been an agreement made with labor and management that because the Social Security system would be increasing benefits to widows with children, and would therefore, in order to on the workman's compensation, in order to equalize things out. They were going to reduce the benefits to widows without children and to adjust to meet Social Security. I, since everybody agreed, offered the amendment that did that. Story the next day, first headline, Jeffords cuts benefits to lonely widows. Lead of the story was written that way, saying Jeffords yesterday offered an amendment to reduce the benefits of widows without children, and went on to say the ramifications of that money-wise. And then buried in the middle of the story, he said also, of course, there was an increase to benefits to widows with children, and then on down. So my question to you, in view of that, was that fair reporting? And is that within the license allowed reporters? The facts were absolutely correct, no question about it. Mr. Montserrat.
Based on what I know, which is the first time I've heard of this story, I would say no, it was not fair reporting.
And I don't know what else I could say.
Okay, well, I guess the follow-up question is I have, what latitude is reasonable? Now, we've taken that as an extreme, but there are a lot of, I mean, how do you guide your reporters in how to select facts, or what kind of accuracy do you require of them? I mean, here's a case where, to me, that obviously it was done in order to embarrass the individual and not done for actual, but the facts were correct. Now, how far can you go, and what are your guidelines as to inputting your own editorial decisions in the selection of those facts? What kind of guidelines do you have?
Well, I can tell you what I would do in a case like that. And again, not knowing all the specifics of the case, I don't know what was in the reporter's mind. But in that particular case, I would have tried to find out. First of all, if I'd written the headline, if I'd seen somebody write that headline that way, I would not have allowed that headline to go through that way, because it made a giant leap from one assumption to another. I think it certainly attributed to you a motive that was essentially, I would assume, inaccurate. The headline, and if the lead of the story was that way, it simply would not have gotten by me or hopefully the editors that I hired to do that kind of story. I think that the press in Vermont has evolved, has not been perfect in the past. I think we've seen a clear evolution from a kind of very strong advocacy journalism, which is sometimes a reflection of an individual person, more than it really is a newspaper as a whole. Although I think an editor sets a tone. I can, based on just what I know about that story right now, I would have had a real hard time letting that one go by, frankly.
Anyone else like to comment?
I think it's probably a tribute to Jim Jeffords that he was able to survive the hatchet job and end up spending a decade in Washington.
I think Nick raises a good point about the Vermont Press Corps. Unlike Washington or New York, you encounter a lot of personnel in the press corps in this state who are climbing the learning curve. You have people who are maybe in their first professional job after a college paper, or maybe have only 2 or 3 years professional experience. And in a case like this, when a story needs a frame of perspective, sometimes the newsmaker is going to take pot luck, because you may or may not get a reporter with the capacity to supply that perspective. That's one of the imperfections of the business.
Just for our information, could you tell us the reporter? Was it a Rutland Herald reporter, female type with an Irish last name? Okay.
Now they have a award in her name.
Bernie? No, I'll pick up something. Go ahead, Bernie. Come on, after you guys.
Actually, in terms of relations to the press, Brian has some good stories to tell from the old days too, right?
Yeah, way back. They used to play.
Okay, Tom, I'd like to, and I'm at some difficulty. I don't watch the news every night. I watch it probably a couple of times a week, so I don't see it on all the time. But, Tom, what is a communist?
One of my questions.
Just for those who don't know, I produce and anchor the 11 o'clock news on this station. What is a communist? Someone who subscribes in the majority to Marxist ideals,
Marxist ideals. Can you amplify your background in Marxism?
I am not a theoretician on Marxism.
Tom, when you refer to Daniel Ortega, now I may be wrong, but certainly I know it's true of CAX, one of your colleagues, at least not you. Usually the phrase goes, Daniel Ortega, Marxist leader or communist leader of Nicaragua. Is that a fair statement?
I would question communist. We have used left-wing.
No, you've gone more than left-wing.
We have used Marxist.
Marxist.
I believe.
And again, I see, but the problem is my recollection, and I may be wrong on this, is the word communist ruler of Nicaragua.
I don't think that would be fair.
Marxist?
Sure. On occasion.
Daniel Ortega was elected president of Nicaragua in an election. Why don't we use the phrase Daniel Ortega, democratically elected president of Nicaragua?
It's a fair question. You're trying to characterize the regime in...
Daniel Ortega denies, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Daniel Ortega, by the way, when asked is he a communist or a Marxist, will deny that. Is it appropriate, now, is it appropriate to, if we were to say, and I mean this just facetiously, Ronald Reagan, fascist president of the United States, okay? Ronald Reagan does not consider himself, I don't think he is a fascist, he doesn't consider himself. Is it important to, in defining somebody, to give credence to what they in fact understand themselves to be? If you called me Bernie Sanders Republican mayor of Burlington, it's inaccurate, right? Why do you keep using labels on a guy like Daniel Ortega that he himself denies?
That is a fair question, and it is a trap that television, especially because of the time constraints, falls into. You are packaging a story for a broad audience in a very short period of time. You need a label for the guy. Now, I'm using semicolons here. Very often a reporter in a hurry will take what the wire services supply, which is a mistake, will take prevailing wisdom, which is a mistake. You will hear, the White House say the freedom fighters in Nicaragua. They're freedom fighters in Nicaragua. In Poland, they're freedom fighters. In El Salvador, they are guerrillas and rebels. We try to get away from that. And a thinking reporter will try to characterize government opposition as nothing more than government opposition. We'll try to characterize a left-wing regime and as simply that. I think if we call Ortega a communist, I think that's an error. I don't think Ortega would argue with left-wing.
But in general, when we refer to heads of government, we don't usually say, I mean, sometimes we do, and I think left-wing is certainly not something that he would disassociate himself with. But I do want to say that on WCAX, very often we see derogatory terms used to people like Daniel Ortega, and I object to that.
Derogatory, sir. Is Marxist derogatory?
Within the context of this nation, and when the man himself would say, I think he would say, is he a dogmatic Marxist? The answer is no. I think people who, as presidents of nations, deserve to be given the title and the respect that they themselves understand the situation to be. They understand who they are. When you call, for example, do you say, would you talk about other governments in the same way you refer to Nicaragua? And I think the answer is not. I think the problem that one has in local government, if I may, maybe you want to address this, is obviously you don't have a correspondent in Nicaragua. You get it off the AP. Okay, let me give you another example of something. Okay, and maybe if I can go to Nick and leave.
Well, I want to follow up before you switch gears here.
Okay.
You do have to occasionally characterize governments for the information of people who don't follow politics in far-flung nations. Now, say there's a coup in Argentina. Now, why is that important to the United States? And you have to explain this in 20 or 30 seconds. The government of Argentina changes hands. What kind of a government was it before? What is it now? What is our relationship to that? The story means more to the casually involved viewer if you can explain the political leanings.
Okay, Tom, as you may know, I think the reporting on Nicaragua has been absolutely atrocious. Can you recall the last time that WCAX said anything positive about the Nicaraguan government? Did they ever do anything that's good? Have they made any accomplishments in the 5 years that they've been in office?
I think we have pointed out we have had Nicaraguan officials right here in town.
You have done press conferences with them, and I was at one of those things, and I might recall that your questioning was extremely harsh on them. But let me go back to you. Yes, we have had Nicaraguan people. Terry Bericius, an alderman, went to Nicaragua and had a press conference, which is interesting also. But basically, tell me, if you can recall, and I don't mean hard, I know you go through the news every day, you don't recall everything that's going on. Tell me about some of the achievements of the Nicaraguan Revolution that have been, and why Daniel Ortega might have won the election with 60 or 65% of the vote. What have they done in Nicaragua that the people of Vermont will know about that was broadcast on Channel 3?
I think if you go back through the microfilm and pull the scripts, you'll see that we talked about education, a literacy campaign, which we've done at some length. We've talked about medical advancements in Nicaragua, eradication of disease. We've talked about budgetary problems, farming problems, and what the government is doing to overcome those. I believe that we have not left those stones unturned.
In terms of positive to negative, would you say 80% of the reporting on Nicaragua are talking about contra activities and criticisms of the United States government, of the Sandinista government? Or are we talking about some of the achievements or some of what the Nicaraguan government feels are the problems associated with the United States invasion of Nicaragua?
I think by necessity, a lot of the coverage that we've given Nicaragua has been framed in the context of will the Contras or won't the Contras be getting big bucks from Washington? What is Reagan's attitude towards so on and so forth? So unfortunately, because of definitions of news, when the Nicaragua name comes up, it is often in the next sentence the freedom fighters or whoever did this.
And would it be fair to say that the Nicaraguan name often comes up because President Reagan and his administration have denounced them for one reason or another? And you say, for example, I did see this on Channel 3, if my memory is correct, and I think it is. President Reagan today announced that Nicaragua was a terrorist society, and you reported that news. That's in fact what he said, and WCAX reported it.
Yep.
Was there any other point of view? In my view, that's an absolute lie. Was there any other, after making a rather strong statement, terrorism is not a joke, those are people who blow up innocent people, did we go to the Nicaraguan government to get a response to that very, very strong charge? What did the Nicaraguan government say in response to the charge that they were a terrorist society?
I can't quote you chapter and verse in the actual story, but I can assure you that if the Nicaraguan government put out a response to that through Ortega's press secretary or what have you, and that were available to me as an editor, I would do my damnedest to balance what appears to be sort of a shot from left field from the White House with
well, in fairness to you, because you don't have a reporter in Managua, you are dependent on the wire services. That particular story did not have a response, and I do not accept the fact that the Nicaraguan government did not respond. I don't blame CAX for this, although I would demand that you would be more assiduous before you accepted one side of the story. Let me give you another example. On Friday, there were 3 newspapers, including, I didn't see the Times-Argus, I did see the Rutland Herald, that announced that the Nicaraguan government was restricting civil liberties in Nicaragua. I'm sure that Channel 3 carried it, I didn't see it, but certainly it was a front-page story on all 3 newspapers, okay? On Monday, Daniel Ortega spoke at the United Nations. He gave an important speech. The Rutland Herald covered the speech by having a picture of Daniel Ortega running through Central Park, jogging. He's a jogger. And it said, "President on the run." That was the response of the Nicaraguan government to front-page stories in the New York Times, the Rutland Herald, and the Burlington Free Press. In the Burlington Free Press, underneath a long article on Israel and Italy, there were 3 sentences, and on page 13 of the New York Times, there was in fact a brief excerpt. Do you not think it's unusual that after there is a front-page story about an action of the Nicaraguan government that gets worldwide publicity, that the leader of that government gives a major speech in the United Nations, and it is not reported at all in the American press? And now, am I being naive on that, or did I miss the point?
It was on Channel 3.
How much did you put on Channel 3?
We ran about 30 seconds of his speech and made the major points. Gave him about a minute.
Gave him all of a minute on that.
We have a newscast when the news whole, when you subtract weather, sports, and stupid ads, is 15 minutes. We gave him 7% of our total news whole that night.
Okay, Nick, did the Times-Argus do better than the Rutland Herald on that?
Well, I don't know about the Times-Argus because I haven't been there for 8 months, but
Where are you with now?
it was the reporting of that particular issue was on the front page. Ortega's picture, in addition to the running on the in Central Park, was on the front page delivering his announcement on the civil rights issues. His response or his reasoning for that civil rights action, shutting down the press, or essentially requiring people to come to the foreign ministry or the domestic ministry before they get anything in the newspaper, that was reported as reasoning. And also, prior to that, in both the Herald and the Times-Argus, and I'm sure the Free Press, there have been lengthy articles about what Ortega's point of view is. I don't believe that anybody, any public official has the absolute right to define for the press how to characterize him. In other words, Adolf Hitler, shall we characterize him as a lover of children? He used to do that all the time. He would characterize himself as a lover of peace. Shall we identify him, Adolf Hitler, lover of peace? Today took over Poland in the name of peace. I just don't think Daniel Ortega ought to have the exclusive right to tell us what his point of view is by labeling himself.
If most of, and this I'm not mistaken about, if most of what appears in the New York Times and the wire services says the Reagan administration today announced, and this guy's terrible, he's an anti-Semite, he's a drug dealer, whatever he is, don't you think that now and then we might want to know what the Nicaraguan government in fact feels about these things? And you argue as you may, I would point out that the man gave a major address at the United Nations on Monday. I did not see it in the Rutland Herald, and I did not see it in the Burlington Free Press. What I saw 3 days before were major front-page stories making certain statements. Do you not think within that situation, considering that there is a war going on that the United States is backing, that we should at least hear what this guy's point of view is?
Well, I think we did report what his point of view was. I think you're just upset because we didn't report it at the length that you think that we should have, and you're even upset, if I read my own paper correctly, that the New York Times put his entire speech on page 13. I don't know if you thought that was an unlucky number or whether it should have been on page 1. Do you think it should be on page 1?
I certainly do think so.
The entire speech should be on the page 1 of the New York Times?
I don't think his speech has to be at all, but I think there should be an article, if there is a major article which says that the Reagan administration tells us about certain actions that took place in Nicaragua. I think it's totally fair for this speech to be reported on the front page. The United States now is attempting to destroy that government. That is not the debate, that's the fact. I would like to know what that government has to say in response. Okay, I've pressed that point enough.
Could I get a piece of this? I too woke up the day after Daniel Ortega spoke at the United Nations and ran out to the place I get coffee in the morning and grabbed the New York Times hoping to read something about Daniel Ortega, and found that it was Shimon Peres who got the big splash and what was going on in the Middle East and follow-ups on the hijacking and all that, and I was kind of disappointed. Daniel Ortega was there on a page with about 9 other world leaders because they're getting up one right after the other giving talks, and that was disappointing. Nicaragua and concern for Nicaragua is a big issue in this community that I live and work in, and be it on the radio or in the Vanguard or whatever, I like to spend a lot of time paying attention to that. We've had a lot of people in this town go to jail because, or risk going to jail because of it. It's very important here in Burlington. We have a sister city in Nicaragua. That's also very important. In light of the martial law situation, Monday I came in and followed up wanting to do a story for the radio, WDOT, on the impact of what we heard about going on in Nicaragua on the Sister City Material Aid Program, and spoke with the mayor's assistant, Pat Peterson, and did a story on that. I was told people from here were sent down to New York to try and get clarification from Mr. Ortega and the Nicaraguan embassy on what's going on. That afternoon, and this, I must say it's a treat to be in City Hall when it's not a restricted press conference, but that afternoon the mayor had one of his restricted press conferences to get on at 4 o'clock so we can make the evening news, to do the old Louise McCarran and the Public Service Board stink story again, which we've had a lot of and which we've covered quite regularly as this rate case goes on. At the end of that press conference, in light of the fact that I was already working on a Nicaraguan story, after the questions on the electric situation, I asked the mayor when he said any other questions. Yes, I have a question. It's not on the electric rates. It's about Nicaragua and what role Doreen Kraft may have in contacting down there and trying to get your reaction to what had happened in Nicaragua. I do want to get the other side, Bernie. And you got up, and which is the best move you have in terms of a politician manipulating the news. You've mastered the art. When you're asked a question you don't want to answer, you leave the room. You got up and walked right out of here.
Well, Mr. Frayne, we can discuss my role with the media, but the point of the press conference was on electric rates. The fact that it took place at 4 o'clock in the afternoon was because we just got a decision back, as often happens, is late in the afternoon. Now, the question of whether I should answer any question that you pose to me at any time of the day or night, and you seem to think that I should, I happen to disagree, and that's an issue that I would like to get into, as to what becomes a major story. All right, one of the concerns that I have, in fact, is that when one deals, and I'll get into this at greater length later on, is that some reporter comes in and says, do you, and this has happened, I mean, Jim raised an instance that happened to him a number of years ago. I remember a number of years ago, before I was mayor, there was an issue, somebody bombed a building someplace in connection with the war in Vietnam. And the reporter said to me, what do you think about bombing buildings in opposition to the war in Vietnam? And I said, I don't agree with it. The major thrust of the story is that Sanders does not agree in the bombing of buildings in connection to stopping the war in Vietnam. The thrust would be that I had given any thought to that at all, and that's the famous "do you beat your wife" story. And that's something that we can get into as to questions posed by the media and how one has to respond to that.
Well, maybe we'll back up from the confrontation on that question that we're coming back to later. Mr. Burns, would you?
Yeah, so I'll try to get back to something a little more local and talk to the reporters, something on the reporters. This is for all three of the reporters here. It's a question that I had that came up a few years ago as we developed, and Nick, you touched on the fact that reporting has changed in the last 10 years. When I was in politics, if I tried to hold a press conference the way Bernie has them, they would have skunned me alive, and I'm sure Jim still feels that way. Everything is wide open at the press conferences when we used to have them, or they'd walk out on you. You didn't get a chance to walk out on them, and you got nothing in the press, or you got just bad press. But something came up a few years ago, and with this change of not being such advocates, and with Mr. Loeb dying and leaving us without the St. Albans Messenger to stir things up, we have reporters who receive stringing fees. This comes up with a reporter receives a stringer. Now, this is a reporter who has a local story, and then he sells it to the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, the press. Gets probably $150 if he can get himself a clip on CBS. It's $90, I guess, if on Channel 5 for each time he gets on, if he can plug into that national news. And so all is not bad when there's a train crash. But one of the things we find is, as we heard earlier, that there was cheering in the Free Press newsroom when Bernie Sanders was elected. And part of that cheering was the stringer fees. Automatic comes through because we have a, quote, socialist mayor who is different. And then it behooves the reporters to defend their mayor. And so for the first 2 years, if you look at the stories, we see a great deal of defense. Bernie is allowed to use cronyism as an attack, and yet there is never a published report of the people he has hired, the new people, the assistant mayors, the jobs he says he's going to do away with, the 2 city attorneys, and so on and so forth down the line. There's never a repeat of these salaries published in the paper as they would have been years before. There's never a going back and checking. And part of this comes up as, is this because of stringer fees? And do you believe that a major newspaper who pays their reporters for putting out newspaper should also be able to sell the same story to other press, or should the paper get that fee? If it's any good, the paper should get the fee. They belong to it. Number one. Number two, is this the downside of this now plays against Bernie, where it's not news anymore and they can't sell him nationally anymore. So now, in order to get a stringer, they must destroy him. So now we have 2 bad stories, one on the way up and one on the way down. Now, shouldn't we do away with stringers?
I'd like to respond briefly. From a broadcast standpoint, stringer fees got nothing to do with it. In broadcasting, you make your stringer fees 2 ways. Features, cute babies, fall foliage, skiers, and spot news. A lot of folks in our newsroom took vacations because of the Amtrak wreck. But you don't get stringer fees for continuing stories like this. You don't, I mean, the CBS television network is not going to buy a story on Mayor Sanders every 3 months, whether he's, no matter how startling he is.
Every time there's a story on from Burlington, on any issue in Burlington that you can put on that has to do with that, don't you get paid?
Yeah, but they don't buy those.
Just because the story is run concerning his administration before doesn't mean you don't get paid if you can peddle another one.
But I can't remember the last time we sold a story like that.
Well, that's why he's getting it now.
No. They don't buy running political stories. It's tragedies and it's features. It's stuff they can load the closed-circuit newsfeed with that other affiliates would be interested in. Now, we think this is important stuff, and it is important stuff to us, but you can't sell Mayor Sanders' story to the affiliate in Paducah, Kentucky. What you can sell is, meteorites landing on homes and cute babies and stuff.
Using the same rules that Bernie used by doing the second question, which we don't allow you to do to us. By the way, that is one rule. We don't really allow you to interrupt a politician before we finish. In the beginning, in order to make Bernard a news story, the press made Bernard an item. They had to make him an item during the first 2 years he was in office. And they made him an item the old way, as we saw in Citizen Kane, of if you don't have a story, blow up the headline and make it a bigger story and put in a bigger picture. And you've got a story. That's all a story is. Blow up the Maine, we'll have a war.
This is just so funny to me.
Does it? You don't see that. If I showed you...
Bernie's the one that should be laughing. Bernie spent the first 5 years of his political life begging newspapers to get in the newspapers. I mean, I wasn't at the Herald at the time, but he just had a bloody war with the editor at the Herald. Why don't you ever report the Liberty Union? Why don't you ever report Bernie Sanders? What's the matter with you people? Don't you care about the issues? What's going on here? What are you, selectively trying to promote incumbents? And Bernie has become, through a lot of hard work, I might add.
Nick, that's the old press that I was talking about.
No, I think it would still hold true today. I think Bernie had a hard time then because he didn't really have a basic credibility. But through a lot of hard work, frankly, which I think is, I really admire a lot about Bernie because he works his tail off, he made credibility for himself. And he got elected to something after a lot of hard work, and he got credibility. And he became a news story. The notion that I would assign a stringer to cover Bernie because, for some extraneous reason, or whether the stringer would actually, I mean, we may have different situations here, so it may not be apropos, really, because they may have different problems.
I'm not talking about you hiring the stringer. I'm talking about the stringer building the story to
sell
more to you.
See, in my newspapers, it's the gatekeepers that do a lot of the determining what goes into the newspaper. The reporter does some. They say, Bernie's doing this today, and then we talk about it. And we say, is that a good story or a bad story? It's not based on building Bernie up. I don't care about building Bernie up. Has Bernie said anything? Is he going to do anything? Is he going to say anything wise? Or is he just saying what he always says? Is it news? Is it new? And I mean, I think that's a vital thing. And sometimes we over-report Bernie, and we over-report people with big mouths. And I think it's a weakness for us. And I think, the press writes a lot of junk, let's face it. And you guys talk a lot of junk. And we report the junk. And I think what we both have to do is try to find a little wisdom before we speak and maybe before we write.
That brings up the second question I'll ask you next, after you finish. Peter, do you think that the press overplayed it in order to...
No, I think the Bernie Sanders epic, which is still being played out, is a big story. The only one of his kind to get up and call himself a socialist, to call himself a radical, to win 3 times. I don't think Alan Abbey, who was the Free Press reporter at the time, was writing or not writing things he should have been writing for the sake of... I don't know if he ever saw the Bernie story nationally anyway. Usually they get hot shots like former Newsweek people come in and scoop those stuff up.
I'd like to follow up along the vein we're talking about, in the sense of news selection. And I'd like to put it in the perspective of an incumbent and a press conference of an incumbent who comes back with a feeling that he has something which is important to Vermonters to hear. And what I want to get at is, what is your obligation to, one, consider it, and two, under what criteria do you make a judgment that what he has said is not news and unworthy, and therefore the subsequent question is what the news is. Let me give you the example. Again, I came to Vermont, held a press conference. The subject of my news conference was to talk about new provisions in the dairy bill. One was the first announcement of the whole herd buyout concept. That was the reason for the press conference. One of the main reporting services because I mentioned during that the administration was not in favor of it, asked a follow-up question, which was, what do you ever agree with the president on? To which I apparently, unfortunately, smiled and gave some things that I support the administration. The headline in the newspaper, not yours, had to downgrading my relationship with the administration, and nowhere in the story was anything about what my press conference is about. Is that this is the same kind of thing which Bernie was referring to, and is that appropriate? What kind of guidelines do you use at a press conference in making a determination as to what is news and what is not news? And it is appropriate to ignore the incumbent who has a duty and obligation to come back to his people and let the people know what he is trying to do for them. Is that appropriate? And it's done all the time. And I'm sure that the nodding of the heads of my other two here.
No, I like it free. I'll take it back.
Well, I don't mind the questions free, but do you not have at least an obligation to report the primary purpose of the press conference if we feel in our own judgment that was something worthy of news in Vermont? And I happen to think that particular one was.
I think a good reporter will go into every press conference asking himself, now, who cares about this? And you got to keep answering that question for yourself the whole time. Who cares? Who is this important to? If you're holding a press conference about dairy legislation, which is critically important to thousands of people in this state right now, and you have a new step or a new proposal or something, then yeah, you bet. And that's what should have been at the top of that story. Other politicians in other places will hold a press conference to announce something which is already out on the floor, for heaven's sake, or to try to say, well, I had a piece of that thing afterwards. But that's not the same. It's a different situation. If it's news and if it's important to your broad audience and not just important to an individual's political career or what have you, then yeah, you bet. We can cite anecdotes back and forth. The anecdote you cite sounds like it got twisted.
Okay, well, I would say that in my memory, Channel 3 is probably one of the abusers of this, in the sense that, not that in the situation, but very often we'll have a press conference, and the press conference will be taped, but then there will be a follow-up question by Channel 3 on a story which is interesting or relevant, and the news that night will not be your press conference, but it will be the follow-up question which that reporter apparently came to get the story. Can you defend that? Is that appropriate to make that judgment when we as an elected officials believe that we have a message to give out, for you to selectively say that the follow-up question was more important for my viewers and therefore will ignore the purpose of the press conference?
In some cases, yeah. It's a question of judgment. You can't possibly make a blanket rule that the headline topic on a press conference should have been the headline topic in the story. You will occasionally come away feeling that you had a more lucid soundbite. In television, we traffic in lucidity. You had a more crystalline concept to put across in a follow-up question than you did in your opening statement. Occasionally, yeah. It's a question of you got to evaluate the primary issue that you called the press conference for in terms of novelty, in terms of importance, and you're looking at maybe a dozen or 18 evaluators, and each of them may come to different conclusions. Okay, I'll come out, see you. We'll have some questions. I'll ask some follow-ups. I'll get back to the office. Marcellus Parsons, my news director, the guy I work for, will say, well, what did he say? Well, he said ABC. Has he said A before? Yeah, I think so. But B sounds good, and besides, we're tight tonight because there's a lot of other stories on the program, and we can only do a minute anyway. Unfortunately, this is the nature of television, too. See, Nick can just print a bigger paper. We can't do a 2-hour show. Unfortunately, if I only got a minute and I have a choice between doing a simple story and the history of price supports in our time, I may be forced to go with the second story and make that the meat of the thing and take the complex story in a sentence or two or in the tag.
If I could jump in, I think Jim raises a very important point. And I know sometimes it gets, we deal with the media every day, and sometimes it gets lost. For example, some of you may have seen recently, and I've had exactly the same experience with Jim, and that gets back to a point that Peter raised, why I don't answer other questions sometimes. I'm willing to say if we're going to talk about electric rates, which is a bloody complicated issue unto itself to put into the 47 seconds that Tom Farmer could do, that I prefer not to talk about 5 other issues. And in fact, I am very conscious of that. But for example, we had a press conference here with the head of the Vermont NEA, Maida Townsend, who's head of a very large union, with the head of the Vermont PTA, with the head of the Vermont Rainbow Coalition, to talk about the need for major tax reform in the state of Vermont. We got up here and we did our press conference, and I thought it went pretty well. And then we had another press conference afterwards. They went upstairs where the media just asked me questions. Not one word of the press conference on tax reform was in the paper. The headline of the paper is, Sanders still not sure whether he's going to run for governor. People keep thinking that I must be a total idiot having press conferences every day announcing, I haven't yet decided whether I'm running for governor. What's the matter with this idiot? Why does he have to have a press conference to announce he doesn't know whether... Well, I don't. I have not said a word on that. And that question keeps being thrown to me, and then the word comes out as Sanders every other day. Sanders has not yet decided. Jim raised, I have had that experience, not only often with CAX. You go through what you think, and it's a difficult problem. Who is the God who makes the decision? He's a congressman. All right? Presumably, he must know something about what he's doing. He says, I think this issue is an important issue, and I want to communicate it to the people of the state of Vermont. Now, in fairness, you're not his press secretary. You're not obligated to do everything that he wants you to do. We understand that. And this is where the tough bind comes. Do you have the rights, if he's not doing this every day, to say, hey, Jim, you're a jerk. That's not important. What we really want to ask is whether you're still sleeping on that couch in your office. All right? Jim Jeffords says he's finally got rid of the couch and he has a real house today. Okay. Who makes that decision? And this is what I think. It's a tough one. I mean, you don't want to be his lackey. But on the other hand, you've got to give an incumbent the right to speak on the issues that he or she thinks is important. And my feeling is, and I want to throw it out to you what I think is reasonable, I think you have the right, and I do this all the time, if you do a press conference on farm supports or whatever he's doing it on, you're going to rip the hell out of him. You're going to ask him every question that you want to ask. You can get somebody who disagrees with him on that issue. You don't just have to transcribe what he says. But I think in fairness to him, you should deal with that issue. Then, at another time, you say, hey, Jeffords, I got a hard question for you. People want to know what you know, this and that, and he should answer you. But I feel the same resentment. Now, Brian Burns, I disagree with some of the sentiments he raised earlier about, cronyism and all that other stuff. Brian, you may recollect, I followed Brian's campaign very, very closely last time, oddly enough, because I ran against him. And I noticed that toward the end of your campaign, at some point, you stopped holding press conferences and you sent out press releases, because I think there was a certain, despite your statement here, you love the wide open thing, I think there was a feeling that you were not getting out the point of view that you wanted to get out, and you found it easier to give somebody a press release. Is that a fair statement?
Well, there's a longer answer than that. But the longer answer is that the press was saying that they'll get it if they can get it in writing, so we gave it to them in writing. And then there wasn't any reason for a press conference until then. They finally started saying, hey, when are you going to have a press conference? I said, anytime you want one. The press was complaining that there were too many press conferences. Even though we were making announcements weekly on things that they weren't digging up, they were joking about it when they'd walk in the office, so I said, fine. So we issued press releases, and they published them, which I thought was foolish. To tell you the honest to God truth, I lost a lot of respect for them by publishing the junk we were putting out. And it was just pure political pap.
I beg your pardon. This was the candidate from...
It was, and they were publishing it with big headlines. And Jesus, I got bored and had press conferences.
But the point... All right, the point here is a real dilemma. It was interesting, and maybe you'll know more about this. I was watching television the day that Snelling announced that he's going to run for the Senate, and I watched something that was interesting. CAX, I saw it on CAX. Leahy had a videotape response that he somehow got from Washington in there, and I think it was Marsilius was saying, despite repeated calls to Senator Leahy's office, the senator did not comment anymore. Basically, he had a statement that he wanted to play in response to Snelling, which I think is not a bad thing, to tell you the truth. Apparently what he was afraid of, and I certainly have not talked to Leahy about this at all, so I'm speaking only from my own assumptions here, he was afraid that if he got on the air with you, all kinds of questions would be asked that he felt were not relevant to the issue. It all gets back to the question, who determines, in fact, what news is?
I'll take it, as a reporter, that's the judgment I make. Let's talk about you brought up the Fair Tax press conference that we had to sit through a 45-minute commercial for the Rainbow Coalition before you would answer questions about city affairs. This is the day after the Vermont League of Cities and Towns kicked your team's butt down in Barrie, and a week before I had done a minute and a half story on our newscasts on radio are 4 or 5 minutes, sometimes with a commercial, with Ellen David Friedman going through the entire fair tax proposal, and we had covered that quite a bit. As far as the press conference that morning, I didn't hear anything new. Just because somebody is the president of the National Education Association or that, there wasn't anything particularly newsworthy that I hadn't reported about that fair tax proposal.
Okay, good. Now we get to another word, which Peter is a star of, and that is Peter will step over dead bodies to get the new story, news. What's first? The assumption being that getting there first and beating the other guy to the radio by 30 seconds is really where it's at. Let me take what Peter said, because it's an important thing. We are talking about a crisis in the state of Vermont in terms of education, which everybody understands, and the problems of municipal services. We're all losing revenue sharing, the schools, teachers are on strike, and so forth and so on. There is a movement coming together, which I'm part of, and admittedly prejudiced about this, which I think is quite significant. It involves the teachers who, for the first time, are playing a very, very active role, not just in asking for money, but getting directly involved in politics. The head of a 6,000-member union is involved with the head of the PTA, with the mayor, with the head of a political organization. Now, Peter thinks that he reported on this, he gave it all of, what is it, a minute and a half the previous week?
On the fair tax movement, yeah.
Okay, all of a minute and a half. And
which is about more than 25% of a radio news.
We can get into the problem that you have there. Why you think that you can do news, or whether your owner of your station thinks you can do news in 5 minutes, and whether you think a minute and a half is adequate discussion to what in fact is a reasonably complex and a very, very important issue, the most important issue facing the state of Vermont. I object to the fact that just because it was done again, now obviously you would be very excited if we stood on our heads and we held the meeting, we held the press conference swimming in the lake, because that would be a news story. It would be very exciting. We saw it, it's not absurd. That's what's news. 5 lunatics today were swimming in the ice-cold water of Lake Champlain, and all the news media was there, and they talked about tax reform while you were there. In other words, it's boring when you just talk about important issues. It's got to be hyped up a little bit more. But the question of what constitutes news and the importance, you're dealing with a very important issue. In all due respect, I happen to think it's worth more than a minute and a half.
Okay, I'm going to step in as moderator role. I'd like to give all 3 of the reporters a chance to respond, because it seems to me both from Mr. Jeffords and Sanders there's been a very clear issue raised, and that is the priorities of a press conference. And I think for those of us who are neither, I am a member of the press, but in this particular role, that we might also at the end of this go-around take a few questions from the audience, because it seems to me that we are in a third role, and that is that we want to hear from our elected officials. We want to know what they think is important. We want them to focus issues for us. At the same time, we all know that they will have a tendency to manage the news, and that we want the role of the press to also be very clear. We always remember Jefferson's famous choice. If he had to choose between government and press, he would always take the press. So we are probably faced with the most difficult dilemma of either one of them, because we have to be able to sort out what we want our elected officials to do and what we want our press to do. So I think the press should have a chance to really fully answer the dual question of Representative Jeffords and Mayor Sanders.
Let me just sort of speak from a newspaper point of view, because I think you really got 2 problems. You've got a broadcast problem and a print problem. I think it's a very legitimate question, and it is a dilemma. There's no question about it. But I think as I was listening, I was hearing a problem that maybe we really haven't identified yet, which is the press conference has a limited use and also selective use for a person to get a message across. In other words, you got to ask yourself, as a politician, is the press conference, first of all, what do I have to say? Is it big news? Snelling had some big news. That was a pretty good format for him. He really sort of orchestrated suspense, and that's true. And we really had no other choice but to fall into it. But he had big news to announce, and it was big news of the type that also required a lot of questioning to be going on. So you put those 2 things together, and it seems to me that a press conference is a good thing for that particular format. But what about a fair tax program? What about this complex interwoven political, financial, and social proposal that your group is trying to put together. I mean, this thing is so complicated. These guys, it takes them half an hour, and they're supposed to be the experts to even explain the thing. No wonder everybody falls asleep. But there are other ways to do that, like the op-ed page of newspapers. I think that's the most underused medium for you people to get across complicated ideas that there is in the state of Vermont. I'm just amazed as an op-ed editor for a number of years how few people woke up to how important that page was, and also how well read it could be if you've got something to say, you say it clearly, and you say it briefly, relatively briefly. And I don't think anybody understands yet, or very few people understand how to communicate on those three grounds. So, you know, is a press conference a good place to do a fair tax proposal? Well, maybe to get the big first splash on WCAX. If you're really after television, though, it would seem to me to make more sense to say, maybe to Tom Farmer or Peter Martin, hey, I've got a new idea here. Is there any possibility of doing a more in-depth interview? And I don't know what the answer is going to be, but
I think your point is very well taken, and in fact we utilize, and I have to congratulate the Free Press that I can't recall when they have not accepted an op-ed piece, and that's very important. But I think as you know, or as Tom knows, that's one thing, and a certain number of people will read it. But the truth of the matter is a lot of people will not read it, who will be watching Channel 3. And then you raise the next question, and it's not a criticism of Channel 3, which is any different than probably any news or any channel in America. How do you deal with a complicated issue in the 28 seconds that you're going to give us, and is the format that you have, and again, you and probably every other television station in America, suitable for trying to educate and enlighten people? Take the waterfront issue in Burlington, an enormously complicated issue. It cannot be summarized into 28 seconds. Why are you not, and again, you and everybody else, trying to allow people the opportunity, the 5 minutes that might be needed to discuss an issue like that?
This is an epidemic problem. It is a problem for all broadcasters, television and radio. The fact is that television is better suited to some stories and newspapers are to others. Now, you want to reach a broad audience with your fair tax proposal, or let's say issue X. And issue X, if it's going to be discussed on television, is going to have to be put in the simplest conceivable language. You can go back and reread a newspaper story until you have it figured out. Television, you're only going to see it once. And that by necessity means that the television interpretation of your issue is going to sound superficial to you, because it's got to be put in words of one syllable, because you're talking to a big crowd of people who only hear it once. It's problematic. Now, why don't we do it in the long form? And that's a good question. And we do some issues in the long form. We're doing a 3-week series on development right now, which is going to add up to over 2 hours of television on a big issue. That kind of thing takes enormous time and resources. I've been shooting that since May, and you can only do a couple of those a year. We should do longer form stories, and since we have an hour show, we have the opportunity for that. But if you're going to schedule a long form piece in a newscast, you have to consider that piece's relationship to every other story in your budget. Now, you know, on a slim day, Mondays are slim days, you can probably come in and say, yeah, we'll do 6 minutes and talk about fair tax. You know, it's going to take us a couple days to prepare it. Will you cooperate with us? Get us some graphics. We'll try to find something to show people and take a reporter off the regular beat for 2 or 3 days, and we'll do this up real well. That'd be fine. But then supposing that you have that prepared and there's, God forbid, a plane wreck, or Dick Snelling has a press conference, or there's a whole confluence of circumstances which fix it so that day you can't do 6 minutes on any one story. Then that's going to get bumped. And, you know, I know there are conspiracy theorists who think that a bunch of guys in suits sit down behind closed doors and this is what the news is going to look like. And it just ain't so. The news is produced in a madhouse crisis atmosphere where there are always deadlines, and it's like getting the right facts out on top and telling a complex story in whatever time the producer gives you is like a parlor trick. And some people do it better than others, and those who don't last. But it is not produced, it is generally not produced with any sort of board of directors' perspective to it. It is produced under fire. And
Peter?
it comes out okay some of the time.
I just add to that, I don't think it's necessarily my job or the job of people in this business to carry water for politicians who want to communicate with the public. We're not the only avenue. Jim Jeffords, if that guy had to buy stamps, he wouldn't have enough money to run for re-election. All he has to do with the congressional franking privilege is send out anything you want. You can get into the mailboxes of anybody in this state. Pat Leahy just comes out with it. I mean, he's stuffing mailboxes. They can't get the real mail in there, and he's doing that for free. And that's a way to get out. Here in Burlington, we've had Jane Driscoll putting out the Burlington Progressive, a newspaper to put out your political philosophy. I don't know if we're going to see more of the issues of it. And we've had Keeping Burlington Informed, which gets into my mailbox, and that's another way to reach the people.
No question about it. I'm sorry, Brian, what do you want to do?
Brian.
Well, I wanted to get on to, and Tom Farmer answered a major portion of it, and it's, I guess I don't have the complaint with Channel 3 that I do with many of the other things. And we have two people who are in public office, and I'm out of public office now, and I'm a citizen who buys the Burlington Free Press and watches Channel 3, watch the commercials, and I listen to DOT, and I buy the products and support them, and I pay my dues to the Free Press, and I want more news. I want more in-depth news. I know you've got a news hole that you have to figure and that you're under a crisis situation. I appreciate the development thing, but I don't feel I'm getting what's going on here in the city. I don't feel I'm getting enough. I watch the rallies, be they on Nicaragua or on whatever the local issue is that day, and they're generally the same group that shows up, the same guy with the glasses and the beard. If I bumped into him in the street, I'd stop, say hi to him, and mention him by his first name. He's been at every rally for the past 4 years, and he's always on the front page of the Free Press. And one week I counted 3 major stories, big, it isn't a lack of space, big pictures and everything else covering the same rallies. And yet, almost no news, and I'm paying for news. And what I would say is, do you force your reporters to publish every day? And if you do, can you free a reporter to do more in-depth, like you're doing, Tom, on more subjects? I know you tried the Dimension stories, which were good, but I'd like to see more of it in the press, where you can get the in-depth in writing delivered to my door, not from the Burlington Progressive or from the Congressional Letter, who will have an axe to grind and a side to put out, but by different reporters at different times, and not trying to do what's popular that week. Not try to feed me the latest story that came out, the latest national issue that they're involved in, but what's going on, something a little more in-depth for some of us that have to vote on the waterfront and decide if we need a new sewage plant, and decide whether it was a good deal to put 222 houses on the north end and trade for whatever amount of houses we got on another section. Shouldn't we have a right to complain about that? And who do we complain to, and how do we do it?
I think you have an absolute right to complain about it. I absolutely agree with everything you just said. I'm not going to be an apologist for the Free Press, perish that thought, but I would like, first of all, in the beginning of this, I'd mentioned that we've gone through an evolution. I think there's a good part of the evolution, which is I think we've become more careful, more responsible, and less taking advocacy positions. But I think there's a negative side to that, too, that we have to be real careful about, and which at the Herald and earlier at the Times-Argus I've tried to make an effort to do, which is to respond exactly to what you just said. If newspapers become like television, newspapers are in big trouble, because the greatest strength that I think we have is to explain to people in greater depth what's going on out there. And we're not just hitting flash, hurricane, earthquake-type journalism. That we need to do a lot of explainers. If you look carefully at the Herald, over the years, they've had a lot of explainers. We had a major toxic waste report and the Free Press has done this too. It's not just us. A lot of newspapers do it. Do they do enough of it? No. In Vermont, I think the demographics are a big problem. We've got 500,000, 550,000 people in this state to support financially 3 major, fairly large, actually not very large, newspapers. By metropolitan standards, we don't have a good, solid revenue base that we can do that kind of work. Now, I think primarily that we do a tremendous job based on what our revenue base is compared to some of the major metropolitan papers.
Quick follow-up on your impression of the 3 people sitting here. Maybe Peter was involved in it. A month or so ago, and maybe 2 months ago, there was a petition signed by the local press here in City Hall saying that they were angry with Mayor Sanders because he gave a scoop to another reporter. And you've been around for a while, Nick. What do you think Mavis Doyle would have done to anyone that do you think she would have signed a petition to any local politician saying, please give me your press release?
No. No.
Could you explain your feeling of if you had a reporter that did that?
Well, I think competition is the name of the game. I think that politicians, however, who play games are bound for trouble because I think that the press has a sense of fairness the same way we all have a sense of fairness. I think you people out there know when we're being unfair. I think that's part of the checks and balances that have brought a sort of evolution in the press. You may not see it, you may not think about it, but I've seen it over 16 years of journalism in Vermont. Partly it's you've done it because first of all, I think you're smarter, you read the papers more closely, and you hold us to account for things. But politicians who play games with reporters and are basically leaking stories to one reporter, and then they may go to another one and say, oh, I'll give you a deal on this one. I mean, they're sort of bargaining in the marketplace, and there are people like that, and they may even be a few right here on occasion have done that. If you get caught at that, you can really get burned badly. If you answer, and this is just my opinion, but if a reporter asks you a question, answer it. And if he's got a scoop, well, good for him. If two reporters ask you a question, answer it. And if two guys have a scoop on the other three guys, then it's the other three guys' problem. They didn't ask the question. That's part of the competition that we go through. But when you start playing games, and it's the same in reverse, if reporters start playing games with politicians and say, hey, I'll do this story for you, and this will be good, you give me another one, and hey, that'll be good, and we got a good deal going here. Whew. Boy, you get in real deep trouble that way, it seems to me.
I just want to respond to that. In this sense.
What we'll do, so you all won't feel like we'll let this particular discussion go for just a little bit more, I think. Congressman Jeffords has a response, and then we'll come out to you, if that's okay.
Just 2 points that I would make. I don't think it's playing games. One of the problems, as I think was indicated, is that I have a tremendous frustration with the institution of television because the nature of my politics is that it is a little bit more complicated. We're trying to take on a system, and it's important to explain the system and why we think change should come. And we can't always do that in 26 seconds. Now, one of the things that I remember, what attracts people to the news, funny thing, some years ago, Mr. Aswad, who used to be chairman of the Planning Commission, and we had very strong political differences. Papers and media, it was great. Sanders calls Aswad miserable guy, and Aswad, it was great media coverage. It was a real political confrontation. Or the police chief and myself, it's good, it's nice and easy. Yet after we won a tremendous fight to create a CEDO office, and we think we have accomplished some enormous changes in the city in terms of redeveloping the old North End, housing, this, that, and the media is not interested. That's just pap stuff. We broke our necks not to fight Mr. Aswad, to do what we thought was best, but it's boring stuff. The old North End today, in terms of housing rehabilitation, parking, we had a press conference, which I will never forget, down in the old North End to try to explain to the media the many changes that we think we have brought about. Almost nobody showed up. Boring. Just pap for the Sanders administration. We knocked our brains out to bring about that change. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are proud of it. But that's boring type of stuff. On the other hand, all I got to do is call Jim Jeffords a son of a bitch. It'll be on the front pages of every paper. It's good media stuff. It's nice and simple. And I have a problem, with that. Now, in terms of doing special stuff, the fact of the matter is sometimes when an issue, and you get back to the very interesting point of the difference between a newspaper and television and radio. The fact of the matter is, in my experience, the reporters from the Free Press could sit down and I could talk to them for a half hour and go over a story at length. They can ask questions, and you end up having something that might make sense to some people. I find it very difficult to do that on the 27 seconds. And you pointed out, Tom, you basically acknowledge, which is true, that talking for television is another animal than talking, I think, for the printed media.
Absolutely.
Okay, and now the reason that you have a popular president in the United States now is very clear.
Absolutely.
President Reagan has total contempt for the media, and the media, of course, have total contempt for themselves. So he refuses to answer any questions. He makes 33-second statements about how great America is, how bad the Russians are, over and over, 5 days a week, in various forms. He gives speech. He has the opportunity to be filmed because he's speaking before one group or another, or he does the media a favor and he's out in the Rose Garden. This guy has not had to answer a hostile question in 5 years about any issue. That's why Jimmy Carter was not as smart and was dumb enough to think that he should absolutely, on occasion, answer hostile questions, which made him look bad. And Reagan learned from that. It's a real problem. So I don't accept as being games that I will sit down with a writer to deal with a complicated issue. I know some of the communications people, the TV and the radio people, feel badly about it. But, you know, I don't have an easy answer to that.
I think all committed broadcasting people feel badly about that. I share your frustration. It's no less painful for me than to break your complex issue down into 26 seconds than it is for you to have it broken. You know, I edit a newscast every night of the week, and every night I throw out things that ought to be on there and cut stories in half that ought to have 2 minutes but are only going to get 1. And I'll tell you, it hurts. You know, we don't sit there rubbing our hands, as I think, you know, some would like to believe. Anybody who has a commitment to telling the truth on the air is upset when you have to tell less of it than time permits.
Well, excuse me, Tom. Are you done?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't feel very badly. And just listening to Mayor Sanders here speaking about that, I'd suggest that he's learned a great deal from Jimmy Carter, too. And very rarely is in a position where he can take a hostile question, if it be hostile.
I will do it once in a while, but I am not going to be subjected. No, and I accept this. And
you said once every 2 weeks and then went 2 months without doing it. Jeez.
Well, there's going to be one there'll be one on Monday, and there should be one every 2 weeks. But the point is that I think that there is a serious problem when one is dealing with complex issues, and you say, hey, Peter, you're basically a gossip columnist. You like gossip. Well, I think do you deny that? Isn't that what mostly you...
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, I deny that.
Really? Then I've been reading the wrong column. I thought it was in the Vanguard.
Well, I realize you may not be a big fan of it, but I don't see any gossip in there.
Well, that was my understanding of what the column was. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that.
Brilliant man like you, I'm surprised.
Is this the part of the show some of you came for, specifically? Representative Jeff?
I'd like to try to get some philosophical expressions on what we've been talking about here. I understand you have to sell your newspapers and you have to watch your ratings on television to see as to whether or not how you rate relative to the other channels that are watched and all. And I understand that in order to make sure that you have the viewers or the readers, you've got to make news in the terms that you make news. I want to know, though, how you sense your responsibility for balancing out, which we've been talking about here. Do you feel a responsibility for reporting on non-news items which are important in the perspective of those at least that deal with them to your public? Or is that, and where does that range in the sense of priorities? Is it at the top, the bottom, the middle, and how much time do you think about these things? Or do you think about them, or the editors think about these things? Or do they go back and analyze their stories or their papers and say, hey, we spent 99% of our time on news items which really aren't of great value to our society, and we spent 1% on things which are important but probably not that newsy, and we better do something about this? Do you ever do that?
Not as much as we should. There is no question that in television, the question is always, my God, what are we going to do tomorrow? You know, it's not, what did we do last month or what are we going to do next week, but how do we fill tomorrow's show? And you don't know hot, naked fear until you've come into work on New Year's Day and you have an hour staring you in the face 8 hours from now, and you got to fill it with something. You are often so consumed by short-term concerns that you don't take 2 steps back, and that is a fault in broadcasting.
I think, Jim, that first of all, I'd like to, people say, I realize you've got to make news to sell newspapers. In the 30s, that was unquestionably true, because they had newsstand sales. We don't have newsstand sale competition anymore. We sell all our stuff by subscription. We can have the dullest newspaper in town. We don't have really that much competition either. We can have the dumbest, stupidest newspaper on earth and still probably get 20,000 people to buy it in Rutland. We don't worry about that. I don't think to myself, man, that story's real good. I can't wait for 10,000 people to buy my newspaper tomorrow morning. We just don't do that. I look at the story and I say, is this news? And we go through the whole process that you would imagine. We do it very quickly. I mean, after you've been in it a while, you just do it very quickly. It's not a great, big, long, elaborate conversation about it. But editors get together and they say, what deserves to be on the front page today? And we make decisions based on, is that story from Yvonne Daly, that human interest story about somebody who's been a victim of a crime in Rutland, does that belong on page 1? Because people are deeply interested in a victim of crime. And also, does that story about Bernie Sanders calling Jim Jeffords a name, does that have any substance? Or is that just, you know, some more political rhetoric? Is there some issue involved in this that there ought to be somebody that we should make important by putting on page 1?
I think we're getting to maybe the most important issue, and that is, again, what constitutes news. Before we began, Paul...
May we hear from Peter? Do you have a comment, Peter?
Well, I'm not sure, Jim, exactly, just if you have an example of what you may mean by someone that isn't so newsy that should be covered that isn't. I don't ever really think, I mean, to me...
I'll give you an example if this ever stops being a men's club.
Stand up, take over.
I would like
Would you use the microphone, please?
I really like to bring up some stuff around the fact that, I mean, the only reference to a woman that's gone on here has been an unfavorable one to some reporter who I don't know. But I would like to bring up what happened in 1982 when Madeline Kunin first ran for governor against Dick Snelling. And there was a forum held in Burlington, sponsored by the Political Caucus, sponsored by 2 other women's organizations, in which every female candidate in the state of Vermont, including Madeline Kunin, was there, and absolutely no press, except one man from the Vanguard, came to that event. Absolutely no press. All of the press I know was informed of that event. Yet every time Dick Snelling talked at a Rotary Club, it was on the front page. And still today I have to hear Mrs. Kunin and Governor on the radio when someone is talking to Snelling. He's Governor and she's Mrs. Kunin. And that's really constant.
Yeah, that's, I mean, this whole bit, you know, now Governor Snelling, I guess... Well, where were you guys? Vanguard was there,
I have
right?
no idea.
Well, let me pick up on that point. There was a concert held a couple of nights ago where we had, I think, between 500 and 1,000 young people. 1,200 young people had organized the Battle of the Bands. Now, Battle of the Bands, not the most earth-shattering thing. But at a time when if a kid throws a rock through a window, it becomes a big story. The kids themselves had done a whole lot of work organizing these things. A lot of the music was original. And what I was proud of is the city itself, which is unusual, had enough contact with the kids. You know, very often cities give functions and nobody comes. Boring stuff. It's not. But 1,200 kids came to a concert in Memorial Auditorium, and in fact, in due respect, the Vanguard apparently was there. Nobody else was there. Is not 1,200 kids coming together to do something positive news? Quite similar to the point that Peggy made.
If anyone out there has a question, just come up to the mic and we'll continue in this informal way. Yes, the press didn't get a chance to answer the question.
I would say that it is news. I think that we've got a problem now in terms of all our human natures, and you may not want to hear this, but I think it's true, that you may complain that you don't see enough good news in the newspapers. We have a lot of good news in the newspaper. I'm not sure you see it, because I think you're looking at the bad news, and I think we all do to a great extent. I think we do, folks. I don't have a good answer. There's no excuse for that. We should have been there.
I don't know anything about your situation. I'm sorry. It was out of my hands. As for the Battle of the Bands, I can tell you that is a problem of finite resources. I have one camera at night. I can cover one story and not much else.
I have a question for Paul McIsaac. Was the Free Press invited here today?
You'll have to ask the question from my post.
We in Burlington are all Free Press readers. Why didn't we have a chance at them? And I think that if they were here, I would have a lot to tell them. I feel very badly that nobody who reports for the Free Press seems to know enough about our form of government to know for what things the mayor is responsible, for what things the commissioners are responsible, for what things the aldermen are responsible. And they always blame the mayor. I don't, I have nothing, I'm slightly mad at myself at this point. But notwithstanding those things, I think that the Free Press should at least, will we get good coverage tomorrow in the Free Press?
I suggest you talk to the tall blonde man in the blue bulletproof vest in the back of the room.
Would you like to come up and join us? Come on. Yay. Make a chair for you right here. The Free Press can respond to you now.
How much information do your reporters have on the way the city government operates?
Well, obviously, I like to think that, and I'm the one that you would want. Yeah, I'm sorry. My name is Don Melvin, and I have, for about the past 2 years, covered City Hall. I like to think that I know what the commissions are responsible for. I guess that I would.
Do you feel the editorial board knows what how the city operates?
It's a question for the editorial board.
I am so frustrated by the fact that they don't seem to know.
Well, you know, just in response to what you said previously, you know, I had a sinking feeling that sort of hiding in the back was not going to work. Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay.
Just in response to what you said before, I mean, as far as the reporters go, I really would deny that there is a tendency to blame the mayor for every problem in the city. Some but not all.
While you're here, Don, I wonder if any of the things you heard today that you wanted to speak to, the question of the press conference, the question of the public wanting to hear from its elected officials what they think the priorities are, and a number of statements that were made about the Free Press, if you want to respond.
Well, I came late, left, and just returned to my great misfortune. It's a question of judgment, I think, as people have said before me. And you have, you cannot make a rule that you are always going to, this is part of the discussion I heard earlier, that you're always going to report first, what the politician says is the most important thing. The press has evolved. I think that part of that is an evolution from the Joe McCarthy years, which he took such advantage of this. He's going to say something, gets reported, and it turns into fact. If a politician is going to hold the same press conference every week, do you do that or do you not? Certainly, it's very, very important that leaders be allowed to communicate with their people, and they must be given that opportunity. Unfortunately, there tends to be, because I think that all of you folks would acknowledge that there is, at some times, an attempt to, on the part of, various or many politicians, to manipulate the media. And what you have, to the best advantage, to get the best play, to whatever it is, people, this is how you succeed to some extent in politics. So the media is always struggling against that. Now, there may be overcompensations where some guy says, this is really what's on my mind, and, and there's, well, this is just political, and you don't, maybe you make a wrong judgment. I mean, there are wrong judgments made in every profession in the world. But, there is a struggle that we can't act as a press agent for the politicians, but nevertheless, it is vitally important that we do allow the politicians' message to get through.
Pull it right out of there. Taking the bull by the horns.
I'd like to ask a question that sort of addresses that place where television and newspapers almost overlap, and that is with respect to the headlines in newspapers. Different issue than the content of the stories. And I'm kind of glad that you're here, Nick, because in a way, at one time you were an editor serving the area that I was a reader within. We know, I think it's apparent, at least it's apparent to me, that this is a particular administration, a national administration, where there's a lot of stake placed in defining who our enemies and who our friends are. Politicians in national office, in particular, I mean, within the administration, have a very large stake in being able to shape the perceptions of the readers as to who we ought to be booing at and who we should be cheering for. And I think that is the root of a lot of Bernie's questions about Nicaragua, which presently is, the number one scapegoat. But I can remember, at least in issues of headlines, that it was recently decided that headlines can be held culpable for the information within them exactly the same way that stories can be held culpable for the information and content, at least in terms of defaming people. I remember an incident in the Times Argus about a year ago, and this is just one story I pulled out because I wanted to think about it, where the headline of the story says, Soviets, and I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but it's something to the nature that Soviets increase arms aids to Angola. Now, I'm not speaking from the point of view of being a Soviet sympathizer, but I did, and I am always curious to look at these stories like this to see how they're handled. I can compare them with the Canadian press because we're so close to the border, and we can see TV from Canada, which doesn't necessarily have the same scapegoat fixations. And what I saw in this story, as I read it thoroughly all the way through, is that the Soviets had provided a lot of help to the Angolan fishing industry, that they had created a whole network of shipping docks and warehouses for the Angolan food supply, and a whole lot of other stuff. And nowhere within that article was there any mention that there had been any military aid to Angola. Now, in this particular situation, or any other situation where a newspaper reader is scanning through at high speed on their way to the sports or the comics, what is going to be the editorial responsibility in a case like this when the headline writer obviously is creating their own sense of the story, and it has no bearing whatever to the nature of the real event?
Did the head say Soviet military aid?
It definitely said arms aid.
Arms aid.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's an inaccurate headline. I think I remember that because I think either you or somebody else, I think, wrote to us to complain about it. It seems to me I remember a complaint, maybe over the phone or something like that. But there just isn't a good excuse for that. We blew the headline.
Who would be we in a case like that? Is there
whoever?
What's the editorial
yeah,
hierarchy?
Okay. The reporters never write headlines, but don't blame them, those poor people. Inevitably, they're the ones that get blamed for the headlines, and they didn't write them, believe me. I don't know any reporter that writes his own headlines. Okay?
As a reporter, I think reporters should write headlines. Nick's an editor of mine. And,
yeah, as a former reporter, I might agree with that. But to take your question seriously, headline writing is in many ways very difficult, and we blow it. There's no question that we sometimes blow it. And part of the reason we blow it is because we haven't got a whole lot of room to mess around with. It's hard to write headlines that are very concise, and this is absolutely no excuse, okay, because I don't think it's excusable for a headline to come out that way. But it happens. There's no question about it. And we're embarrassed when it happens. And we promise we're never going to do it again, and sure enough, there it is, there's another one. And it's sort of like weeds in your garden. You figure you got them all, and there's another one. It's a tough thing, but it's a good newspaper pays a lot of attention to the headlines it writes. And I think at the Herald we do pay a lot of attention to the headlines we write.
May I have one quick follow-up to that? It was right on that same question. What do you feel your obligation is to correct those mistakes? I know I can remember, we all remember these things. I had a headline once, not too long ago, that reported me as voting the opposite way that I did on a very controversial subject. We got the correct information immediately up, and buried somewhere, this was the headline on page the second section of the newspaper, and then the correction is buried somewhere in a small little part on the back of some other page the next day. We'll take that headline. What do you feel your obligation is? You're embarrassed. If the error is that important, doesn't it deserve correction, deserve front page coverage? maybe that's going too far, but don't you have a duty and obligation to rectify that in some manner that it undoes the damage?
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with the first part, and the second part, the front page coverage. I think there are times when we need to make front page retraction. I think they're very rare indeed. They usually are the result of lawsuits. Maybe they shouldn't be the result of lawsuits, but if there's a major error that occurs on the front page, that I think that, for example, Jim Jeffords votes for napalm, and it ends up on the front page, and it's a major problem for you in a campaign. We ought to have a story the next day on the front page that says Jim Jeffords didn't vote for napalm.
But it doesn't happen. Why not?
Well, I don't think that particular case has come up. I don't think it's been that.
How about the case that you're familiar with that I sued you? And,
well, we won the case, though.
well, you didn't win the case. You won the fact that that my ex-wife was a public official, so that we had to prove that you did it maliciously, rather than just prove that you were handed the information from a campaign opponent, and that when the information was proved false, you printed it on page 7 that it was false, and then you proved that I was a public official, so we'd have to prove malice. That's all you won. You never put it in the same spot.
We would disagree about the outcome of that case, Brian. As a matter of fact, before I came over here, I took a look at that case because I had a funny feeling I might hear about it.
I had forgotten all about it till he just...
I know it real well, Brian.
We're gonna start moving towards.
Well, could I ask Tom, what do they feel? And I've had the same thing happen at least once on television, and it never got. They apologized and said, "No, great, no, I'm sorry about that," but nothing ever occurred.
Nothing ever got on the air.
No, it wasn't your station, incidentally, so you're free on that one. But
oh, good. We will do an on-air retraction if individuals like yourself feel slighted and ask for it, and I have done a couple.
I want to introduce the next person actually from the audience who's going to ask a question, because the kind of dialogue that's gone on today and the kind of time that we've taken is one of the things that we've always defined as community media. And one of those people in this country who's helped to define what those ideas are George Stoney, and he's an important part of this weekend.
I would just like to put this discussion in the context of alternate media. In the beginning of this discussion, there was a great deal of mention about credibility. And it seemed to me that the media was defining who was credible and who wasn't credible. Fortunately, if we use the media ourselves, we can develop our own credibility. We don't have to depend on you. The second thing is that we have the time to give those details. I was out at Bloomington last weekend before last and sat next to the mayor who had she was introducing me at a keynote speaker and so forth and so on. She said, "Professor Stoney, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for public access." And she told how she got recognition because she went down to testify at the school board. She said, "I'm a poor woman. I couldn't afford to run for office except for this. I went down to the school board hearing. People saw me. They encouraged me to run for school board. I ran for school board. The school board was on cable for 2 years. People recognized me. They elected me to the council and finally the mayor." She said, "I couldn't have afforded to go into politics if it wasn't for that." Then she told me how it was helping her as a mayor. She said that just because the camera is there for beginning to end of the city council, the papers are much more careful about selecting kinds of things that happen. She said, "Now I'm doing that at my press conference. The cameras are always there so that if I get shafted like that, I can simply get it repeated again and show it." Now, the important thing is that she has to recognize that public access is available to everybody and not just to the mayor. And our problem is that we are becoming more and more beholden because of the cable legislation to City Hall for our support and authorization. So we've got a real battle there, and that's one of the things I want to bring up here.
Any responses here before we on these questions?
I think he's exactly right. I watch now and then, and I'm very excited about the fact that we are going to have cable access and improved cable access in the city. And every now and then I watch on Wednesday night. For example, they had Snelling's press conference on in full. And it's a delight to be able to see something in full. It gives you a very different picture than the 38 seconds that Tom can put on. And I look forward to Board of Aldermen meetings being televised. I think it's going to, and school board meetings being televised. I think the people will gain. Your point is that it shouldn't only be the elected official who could dominate that. But I think the fact that you have the time. You can spend 2 hours to have a lengthy discussion where people can really, who are interested, hear the issues, I think is extraordinary.
I just like to make a comment. I'm going to have to leave also. I just, first of all, I think it's excellent, but I would like just to point out that there are detriments to sometimes to too much coverage. You'll find that with the House proceedings that we have down in Washington. It has prolonged our discussions on bills which used to go through rather quickly, rather ad nauseum at times, because everyone, especially if they're running for the Senate or have some particular problem back home, all have to get on. And it also builds up an expectation that if you don't say something, you're probably not doing anything down there, when the realization is that probably you ought to be back working in the committee doing something rather than on the House floor where nobody's listening to you. So I want to just warn you, there are some downers to that side of it, and you have to be careful about that. I just would like to end by saying that I deeply appreciate being invited here today, and I happen to believe to be one of those that enjoys probably a better relationship with the press than some others. So if I have raised the points here tonight, I've done that to get an understanding, and I'm not just trying to rectify any ill will I may have created, but I would just say that I do appreciate to a large extent the freedom of the press that we do have in the state, and their attempts to try and be as balanced as possible. But I also feel, as I've articulated, and Bernie has and others, that like all of us, we can improve, and hopefully through the discussions tonight, that this afternoon, that we all can improve from what we have learned here today, and I certainly feel better about things now.
Sure, come on up. Finally made it. Okay, my name is Mitchell Labuda from Grand Isle. As I walked in here, I picked up this, does the media lie? Well, I can't say for a fact that the media lies, but I will say, if it came to a choice, yes or no, I would say yes. And I say this with good intention, because I am one that some of the news medias has censored unfairly, and I'm pointing right at the free press right there. Now, I have sent letters to the free press time and time again, and they censor it with phony baloney excuses. Now, that's one thing. Another thing, September 24th, important hearings and meetings took place in Montpelier. Now, the people should have been notified of what took place in Montpelier that day. And the only news media that did notify the people is the Rutland Daily Herald. Now, we have a Commissioner of Education, Stephen Kagan. He made some unbelievable, preposterous statements over their predictions. And this is the only paper that printed that. Now, we have the news media. Where were you, gentlemen? Why didn't you report on what Kagan said? Mr. Frayne?
September 24th, I was not aware of that hearing in Montpelier. Being usually there alone, I cannot leave on a regular basis and still cover half-hour broadcasts. I wasn't there, Mitchell. I did get a letter from you, though, pointing out that...
I was just going to come to that. Not only did you get a letter...
Everybody got a letter,
Everybody got a letter, but not one, to my knowledge, of any of the news medias took up any of the contents of that letter. Why? Is it because I am just one of the rank and file? Why didn't you people, you're the news media, how come you didn't follow up on the letter to Coonan and the letter which had the contents of Commissioner Kagan's statement? How come none of you ever said one word publicly?
Well, you're telling me the Rutland Herald did, didn't you say?
Yes, about Kagan's statements. But everything else, you people didn't follow it up. Now, how are we, the people, supposed to know what's going on and participate in our government unless you people notify us? You're not doing your job. None of you. And I'll say, I commend the Rutland Daily Herald. I really do. Because I sent 2 letters concerning the same subject which I'm speaking of now to the Burlington Free Press. And them peanut heads sent both letters back on the phony excuses. Now, I have a letter here with the same contents which I sent to the Rutland Daily Herald, and they printed it. There's nothing in here that's wrong. It was printed in yesterday's Daily Herald. Again, I want to commend the Daily Herald. I wish you people would move into Burlington. We need another newspaper here, buddy. I mean it. This poor mayor has been taken, beaten because he's a politician, but they're beating on me now, employing ugly censorship. Now, I'll close with this. If newspapers, and that goes for most of the news medias in this speaker's opinion, are useful in overthrowing tyrants, it is only to establish a tyranny of their own. With loud professions of freedom of opinion, there is no tolerance, no sacrifice of interest, too frequently no decency. And again, last but not least, and as one which some of the media has deliberately employed ugly censorship against, I call for the establishment of a Vermont News Council, the same as the state of, I believe, Minnesota has, to protect the public from ugly media censorship, from bigotry, to protect the public from press and news media's unfairness, to promote and protect the free flow of information. It is very obvious that the people badly need such a news body, control body, or whatever, but more so to be able to enjoy and employ the constitutional right to freedom of speech and expression.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to, just by way of, so we could move to a conclusion, I'd like to hold response on the suggestion of some kind of a news council. There was one other person that had a question, and then we'll go to a summation. Yes, John. Looking very nice today, John.
As someone who works in a profession that's held in even higher regard than politicians and newspaper reporters, it's like to make an observation about the objectivity of the press. I think asking objectivity of the press is like asking objectivity of politicians. And I've learned that people who profess their own objectivity the loudest are usually the ones who have the biggest biases, because they're so biased they don't see it. And I think the biggest illustration of that is the American treatment of, say, events in Latin America. You compare the Canadian media to the American media, they're just 50 miles away. There is just light years difference. But aside from that, I think the real dynamic here is that it's just interesting that you're criticizing each other because you really need each other. Politicians can't survive without the press any more than the press can survive without politicians. You want to see a bunch of disgruntled reporters deal with a group of reporters covering a very dull election campaign. And they all say, Jesus Christ, this is the dullest election campaign. We have nothing to write about. There's no interest. And I think the biggest illustration of the symbiotic relationship was the main event, which was billed tonight, and that was the ongoing feud between the mayor and Mr. Frayne. I'm not sure that Mr. Frayne has any kind of real beef with the mayor. I think Mr. Frayne has found out is that he becomes very much a source of attention if he attacks the mayor. And it's become very successful. I know I went out and picked up the Vanguard. The first thing I looked at was the inside track, because, you know, what's the latest installment? It's really was the first version of Leave It to Bernie. Sort of. So my remark to the press is that you and I both have something in common, and that I think that's true for one member of the panel in particular. If Bernard Sanders was not mayor, we'd probably both be out on the street selling pencils.
I would just before turning to your last remarks, like to point out something that Vermonters may sometimes forget. It's unlikely that what we just went through for the last 2 hours would have happened in very many other places in the United States. And though I see some people shaking their heads, and they're probably those who are not from Burlington. To imagine in even towns this size in other places in the United States, extremely unlikely that politicians would make themselves this accessible, and that the reporters would also be willing to be put on the spot. And we started our little press conference in the beginning. There was some nervousness up here. There was a sense that you've got to answer these questions, and I think they did a really good job. I'm not saying that everything's been resolved on the questions that have been asked, but it's an unusual place, this state, and it is unusual that this kind of dialogue can go on, and it's all on tape.
I trained to be a reporter by driving a cab in Chicago for 6 years. I learned how the world works. I learned the difference between bullshit and truth. And that kind of a perspective is the perspective I bring to my job. And whether I'm dealing with a Bernie Sanders, a Dick Snelling, or a Madeline Kunin, they're all the same in my book. I don't know any of them personally to the point where I could have any kind of love or hate feeling for them. Not having been inculcated with all the great history of journalism and how noble it is and everything, I don't carry that around with me. But from experience sometimes in my position, when I do write things that are very unpopular with a Mr. Sanders or a Mr. Snelling, I really feel that I try to write the kind of things I wanted to read when I was picking up that Chicago Sun-Times out of the O'Hare cab pool. And that's the kind of stuff I try to write. C'est fini.
We disappoint people every day. And we've had some of the disappointed people stand up here and this afternoon and give us the evidence. We leave out an awful lot more stuff than we cover. That is the nature of the business. I would add in the next phrase that if you think it's bad here, you should look at major market television. For all our faults, I think we have an exceptional quality of journalism in this state compared with other cities our size. To say nothing of big cities. If you want to be truly distressed by television journalism, go watch TV in New York City one evening, because there is just nothing going on that program. By comparison, we have a fairly high-minded approach to the job for all our faults, and a fairly public-spirited trio of station managements. Remember that my management could make an awful lot more money with Mary Tyler Moore reruns instead of me for half an hour every evening. That they sink as much time and effort and money into the job as they do is some kind of tribute. I think public access is an awful lot of the answer to the television problems that we've discussed this afternoon.
We've got a long way to go. I just think we're not doing a very good job in many ways in that respect. And again, it goes back to what I said about wisdom. I think we all say a lot of things, and we all read this stuff, but I mean, I challenge you and myself to find maybe one nugget of wisdom in tomorrow's Rutland Herald. You know? I mean, real wisdom, the kind of stuff that really moves you to do something.
The only final point that I would have is that, you know, from the part of this that I was here for, there's been a certain amount of dissatisfaction by the politicians here expressed for the media, and I think that's good. We're natural enemies. Politicians are powerful. The news media certainly very powerful. We were working together in tandem. What a scary prospect. And I think that any time that you have politicians just singing the praises without qualification of the news media, you're going to find that you're in a very, very sorry state.
I think a built-in problem within capitalism is that, and it's not easy, socialism or capitalism or anything, is the media, admittedly, no one will deny, is a business. All right? Gannett makes a hell of a lot of money. All right? Burlington Free Press is a successful paper. I suspect CAX does very, very well. I don't know, I don't know in detail. The people who own these institutions are, by definition, wealthy people. Now, the question is, and this is not to attack, and I think we have honorable people here, but very often, will the media itself allow a tone to develop, a way of coverage to develop, which really makes the establishment and the system held to be accountable? Will the media gravitate to taking on? People think the mayor of the city of Burlington has a lot of power. I really don't want to hurt your feelings. I wish we did. We don't. The establishment, the people who own the state of Vermont, do you ask questions like, who owns the state of Vermont? Where is economic power? Why do we have so many people earning minimum wage? I think that there will be a built-in tendency not to mix it up with the ruling class because they advertise. Now, I know that people will stand up to advertisers too, and I don't want to overdo this, but I think it's hard to mix it up with the ruling class, and I think that's a built-in problem that we have.
What I want to see now is, rather than just that side, I want to see some discussions. I don't want press conferences of my politicians where he comes and announces a new dairy program that I can read about and he can tell me in one line. I want your people to come loaded for bear with a dozen other questions. I don't want Bernie Sanders talking about electric rate increase that he doesn't understand, that he's been briefed on before he walked in the room, and he's going to argue with Louise McCarron again to say the same thing over again that she says, Bernie, the legislature passed the law.
Running for mayor again? Is that
Yes,
what this
I'm
is?
not done, Bernie. I couldn't debate you then. We'll do it now. And I don't want to see that. I want these people to go in and question him about what they've done the research on that previous week. When they finally get the clean shot at him, I want to see it. And I want to see him have to answer it without being briefed by a bunch of people around him. I want to see if he doesn't know about it. I'd like to see that, and I don't want to see the briefings.
Sorry, Brian.
Another train wreck?
No, battle of the bands. Get over here.
I want it a little bit more open, a little rougher, and let's get into, if you want to serve in politics, by God, you're going to spend my bucks. I want to know where they're going, and I want to know why you're spending them there.
I want to thank you all for coming, and maybe a big round of applause for you and us and the whole process.